Hey everybody, what's going on? Hallowed here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today, and today I did want to finally give my review of Gwen, the Hallowed Seamstress. Now, she's been out for only a couple of days, but I've gotten a few games with her over the weekend especially, and what I'm going to say today shouldn't be too much of a surprise here. I think everybody kind of understands at this point that Gwen is a cut below the rest. Now, we were already sad to find out that this champion was not going to be Isolde, and now we're sad that she's kind of weak on release. She did get hotfix buffs on day one, which I was not a big fan of, but I'll talk more about that a little bit later. But generally, I think that her general design and play pattern are just not strong enough right now after release. Let's just go ahead and start with the bad here. Gwen is a skirmisher, which is a high-threat champion with target-agnostic damage who is reliant on mobility and a limited defensive suite to survive in teamfights. Master Yi, Riven, Yasuo, and more recently Lilia are all examples of skirmishers. Yi can meta-tank his way to victory. Yasuo has Windwall, which admittedly is a little niche, but a very powerful tool if he's able to use it correctly. Riven has Valor and a lot of mobility. That sort of a thing are all things that define what a skirmisher is. In that regard, you can very definitely see how Gwen is supposed to operate as a skirmisher. She does a lot of percent max health damage thanks to her passive, she has a lot of mobility with the constant resets on her E, and she is able to protect herself with her W. However, the biggest problem is that her only defensive tools, her very limited healing from her passive and Hallowed Mist, those are just not enough. The healing already isn't very impressive, especially not in lane where she can use it the most. And the worst part about it is that while her W is strong in teamfights, it does jack all to help her in lane against bruisers like Garen, fighters like Renekton, assassins like Talon or Zed, and even some tanks like Malphite, as they all want to be on top of Gwen as they're fighting her, which therefore means they're inside of her zone's range, and therefore they're completely ignoring the biggest reason why W is a powerful defensive tool. Yeah, she gets bonus resistances, but remember, this is a champion that's balanced around being untargetable a lot of the time. That means that her defenses, her bonus resistances sort of help her, and they still at least reinforce to Gwen that she wants to be fighting in the zone, but it doesn't do a lot for you when a Garen is spinning in your face or when a Renekton's dashing on top of you. You just don't have enough tools that can really help you survive in these sorts of teamfights. So what it means then is that Gwen has to be perfect placement with her W, and that's so difficult to do because you have to try and get Gwen inside and the target outside, but Gwen also in range to damage the target while she's staying in the zone and keeping the target outside of the zone. And that's brutally tough to do even with the free reposition that Gwen has. There's just no real way for Gwen to set that up short of either getting extremely lucky or being extremely good. And that's why I'm a little hesitant to say that Gwen needs hotfix buffs right now, as I do kind of feel like with enough time players will potentially get good at figuring out how to position her zone, but it does feel right now that it's way too punishing for activating that ability and trying to position it because of how big the zone is. Honestly, I could see Riot maybe shrinking the size of that zone, which would actually be a buff, as it would make it more localized and therefore easier for Gwen to be inside the zone while keeping the target outside of the zone. But because of this sort of difficulty that Gwen has with where the zone is at, she has no defensive tool, which means that she's a glass cannon without range to ease her difficulties and very limited utility. She also has precious little ability to make plays happen on her own, which a lot of other skirmishers can kind of empathize with. Master Yi only has movement speed to run you down. Lilia needs to stack up her Q passive in order to really get into the middle of a fight, but at least they have ability to sort of brute force it if they have to, right? He can press R and run you down if absolutely necessary. Is it ideal? Not really, but like, he can do it at least. Conversely, Gwen doesn't really have that ability. She can do it, but it's a very clunky pattern of R'ing an enemy for the slow, then E'ing forward and auto-attacking a minion to both get your second R cast and to get the cooldown reduction on your E, then using that second R cast in order to slow them again, then ideally running after them long enough to get the second E dash into range. You're kind of seeing how this is a very difficult proposition for Gwen to actually run down an enemy champion and get damage onto them and really be in the situation where she wants to be thriving in this kind of fight, right? So her ability to actually do anything, even when she's ahead, is so severely limited that, like, a lot of other skirmishers just do what her job is better. And now, while I understand why Riot have the lockout on her R to prevent her from being too bursty, getting all 9 needles immediately in a fight would be absolutely absurd and let Gwen function as sort of a burst mage, but it does make her really clunky to play, especially while she's trying to run down enemies and actually make something happen without her team. So all in all, Gwen is sort of like Kayle if Kayle never became ranged and had limited utility for the rest of her team. Now, there is potential here for Gwen to be maybe played in another lane, but even thinking about other lanes that Gwen can be played at, she is not really going to excel at any of these. A jungle Gwen can't really gank. She doesn't have a tool like Highlander or Dragon's Descent to actually close the gap and get on top of enemies. So again, her only real ability to do anything in this situation is run at you and hope for the best with the limited slow she's got from her R. And mid-Gwen is going to get shoved in constantly because she just doesn't have the wave clear due to her ability, due to the fact that she's melee and doesn't have a lot of tools in order to sort of affect that situation. So I do feel like Gwen is at least okay in the mid lane thanks to her W, giving her relatively good protection from crowd control skill shots, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But generally speaking, I just don't feel like she really has a place in the game right now. But definitely mid lane is sort of my pick for where Gwen may actually see play in the future, as that sort of is giving Gwen options for what she can do thanks to her W kind of functioning in that lane itself. But enough of the bad. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the good here. I do think that Gwen has a very interesting toolset, especially when she's in teamfights. Her W is crazy good in teamfights by sort of isolating enemies in a similar fashion to how Xin Zhao's R does. But in this situation, Xin Zhao can still be crowd controlled. Gwen can't. Gwen is completely immune to anyone outside of the zone, and a lot of enemy champions will be hesitant to step inside the zone to help her friends because then they're in Gwen range and they may be taking a bunch of damage from Snip Snip or from additional casts of Needlework. So in that regard, it's sort of really good for her to get on top of an enemy that's maybe been crowd controlled, set up the W zone, and really start going ham from there. W is also an incredibly good tool at keeping her safe from very powerful skill shot CC initiation tools, and even some non-skill shot CC initiation tools. Things like Call of the Forge God, or Evelyn's WQ combo, I should say, or Enchanted Crystal Arrow, or Morgana bindings. Like all of these things, Gwen just straight up says, I am immune to this at the speed at which I can press my W key, right? Which is a really powerful ability. It's sort of like Sivir E. If Sivir pressed E once and then always had that E on for the next couple of seconds afterwards. Like, that's how good it is. It sort of says, yeah, I can eat the first crowd control ability and the second and the third and the fourth as long as I'm not in, or as long as they're not in the area of effect, which is a really, really powerful place for Gwen to be. Additionally, her healing is low, which I know I talked about a little bit before, but it is actually relevant, especially later in the game. I've survived longer than I expected in a few team fights just because of a max stacked snip damage just kind of healed me this huge burst of health that the enemies and myself weren't expecting, or things like Needlework landing a bunch of the 3-stacked or 5-stack needles on clustered enemies and sort of gaining a bunch of health off the back of that. That's been really good as well. There's also some fun kind of things that she can do with her abilities. Q, for example, can be buffered, so because it's not a channeled ability, so Gwen does have the ability of pressing Q as an enemy is getting on top of her and crowd controlling her, and she still gets the full snip off, which is really good. And she's also good into tanks top. She's not going to run them over because of how squishy she is and how difficult her positioning is, but she does at least have options for dealing with tanks. She does sort of have the ability to stay outside of their sort of zones of effect and deal a bunch of damage to them and kind of be able to farm up into them. So especially if you see the enemy team is playing a tank top, like that is the situation where you can play Gwen into that because she's actually going to be relatively okay into them. And if they do try to end up in a side lane scenario later in the game, Gwen is quite strong into that as well. So in general, I do feel like Gwen's sort of okay in these sort of late game team fighting scenarios or where she has her team to set her up and actually let her do things. I think is the biggest problem I have with this champion right now is that her kit is just really not supporting her and letting her actually, like, you know, thrive in a way that a lot of other skirmishers can, when very much so is team dependent and doesn't have the independence that a lot of these other champions can do. But at least when she does have her team supporting her, she can actually get in there and do a bit of damage, which is quite nice. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of Lilia, who isn't like a crazy good side lane threat or duelist or anything, but if you are able to get some team support behind a Lilia player, they will kind of sort of do a lot of things for the team. Additionally, I want to say that being on the weak side isn't a bad thing for Gwen, as I feel like it's easier to numerically buff a champion that's well designed rather than having to strip tools out of a champion's kit that has too many things. I think we can all remember when the Aurelia rework came out. Aurelia is supposed to be a skirmisher, and she had to lose so many tools off of her kit because she just had too many things going right for her and not enough things for Riot to numerically change. They had to basically say, yeah, so the bonus shield damage has to go away and the disarm on her R has to go away, and we have to do all these things in order to get her into a good spot. Whereas Gwen is kind of in a situation where it's like, she just needs better numbers, really. I don't think she's that far off from being relatively viable, outside of maybe that W change like I talked about. Additionally, and this is why I wish Riot had waited longer to give her buffs, is that Gwen is a skirmisher, and skirmishers are supposed to be very high skill cap champions. These are the kind of champions that if you play them almost to the exclusion of all else, like, you should be able to solo carry so many games on these champions. Like, that's how strong that they should ideally be. So, but the thing about it is because they're high skill cap, you really need to be spending a lot of games to play this champion, to know their kit in and out, to be in all sorts of scenarios with them in order to eventually get into a place where you can be like, yeah, okay, I understand how this champion works and I can make them work for me and I can really play them quite well. Because a well-played skirmisher, like I keep talking about Master Yi or Yasuo, like a well-played Yi or Yasuo are really scary to deal with, but the question is just how many are you going to see that actually play that well? And Gwen is one of those champions, which is why I kind of wish that Riot had waited a little bit longer before choosing to buff Gwen up. That being said, the buffs she got were fairly limited, so I'm not altogether that sad about what they decided to do, because I do think that it's, you know, it's not egregious what they chose to buff on Gwen, and they don't have any current buffs lined up for her on the docket, but I would like them to give at least a couple of weeks for players, especially those who are really committed to Gwen, to play her a ton, and to sort of get used to how she works and what she wants to do and how to optimally position her zone, so that way they can get the maximum value from this champion. So either way, definitely a weak champion on launch, but I'm kind of excited to see where Gwen will end up over the next couple of weeks as players continue to play her. I can kind of say at this point that she's probably not in my wheelhouse, but I definitely can see the fun in her, especially sort of dashing around in a fight and using her abilities to kill enemies by death by 1,000 cuts. But let me know what your thoughts are of Gwen down in the comment section below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts, especially if you're building her differently or playing her in different positions or roles. I'd love to hear what you guys are doing, especially if you're finding success on this champion. Please tell me what you're doing. I would love to be able to play this champion slightly better. So let me know all that down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed today's video, go ahead and leave a like. And if you really enjoyed today's video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.